You're listening to The Big Cast, your source for the latest in financial technology. Brought to you weekly by the Best Innovation Group, with your hosts, John Best and Glen Servati.
Welcome to another edition of The Big Cast. My name is Glen Servati on behalf of the Best Innovation Group, where we like to do cool things with financial technology and really focus on the key aspects of how it's affecting particularly the credit union world, along with the founder community in the startup space. This week, I think we've got some great information. Greene, our friend from the Atlanta Fed, is going to be joining us to talk about the latest insights from their ongoing survey and diary project of consumer payment choice, which I think gives us a really good insight into the way people think about their payments and help design products that can make that work the most effectively. So we'll be getting to that in just a second. Remind you can always find out more about the Best Innovation Group by checking out our website, big-fintech.com. Lots of great stuff going on out there around AI development, API connections, core conversions. Take a look at what we have to offer. Take a look also at the CU Town Hall. The next episode we'll be doing of that. Not episode, I guess I call it a session. Will be on Wednesday, July 9th. It's 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. That one's live and hopefully very lively and interactive as well. It's free to attend, but you do need to register in advance. cutownhall.com is where you can do that. You'll also find a link directly at the Best Innovation Group website. This episode, I'm calling it an episode again. This session, we're going to be talking about youth banking. We've got a credit union and a company that's actually focused in that space. They're going to be joining us, kind of talking about the opportunity to really engage the next generation of users. So I hope you'll join us for that one. And if you're not able to join live, you can also go out to that cutownhall.com website and check out past replays. That one will be up not long after the July 9th date. Biggest news I wanted to focus on before we jump to the interview this week was the passage of the Genius Act regulating stablecoins. By something that in this day and age, I guess, qualifies about as broad of support as you're going to find, a 68-30 vote in the Senate. That accounts for almost all Republican votes and a fair number of Democratic votes as well. I think it was 28 of the no votes came from the Democrats, because there were 2 no's on the Republican side. That means that you still got about 22 or so that came in favorable on the Democrat side. So it's an interesting one. It was considered a win by America's credit unions and a lot of the other industry groups around financial institutions, in particular because there were attempts to add onto that the Credit Card Competition Act and other efforts to cap interest on credit cards. Those were left off. It was a clean bill that went through. I think people are tending to forget that the House still has to pass this as well. So it's not officially law yet. The House has their own version that they have not passed yet, which was called the Stable Act. They're both acronyms, the Stable and Genius Act. Get it? There's a few differences. The request now has come out from President Trump to say, hey, let's just pass a clean one. Let's pass it the way the Senate did with the Genius version, and we'll see what happens. Doubt that's exactly going to happen, but based on everything that we've been seeing, I think it's a pretty safe bet that this thing's going to pass in the not too distant future. The key, and then one of the things I find fascinating about this too, is the fact that the crypto bros are lined up around this one. If you had told me 3-4 years ago that the crypto community would be getting gung-ho about, hey, yes, we want regulation, we want guardrails around our stuff, and guess what? We want to integrate with the existing legacy, traditional financial services community. Those were kind of the exact opposite of what actually got the crypto community going in the first place. Having said that, these are stable coins. They're not the same thing as the overall meme coins or even Bitcoin. They are supposed to keep value at exactly pegged to the standard currency. The differences between the Stable and the Genius Acts, my favorite thing I've seen so far is from the law firm Arnold Porter. Did a good write-up on that, and I will post a link to that one. A couple of the keys that come out, I think, are really true in both cases. It's made clear that stablecoins will not be FDIC insured. They are not legal tender. Critically also, they will not be treated as securities, which is one of the big things around regulation. One that I really don't understand that much is the definition that they will be backed dollar for dollar. The dollar for dollar part makes perfectly good sense to me, but in US denominations, it must be backed by US currency. A lot of these stablecoins originally were being set up also to be pegged to the British pound, the euro, things along those lines. And they may still be, but the market has been taking care of that pretty clearly, because well over 90% of all stablecoin usage, good old-fashioned US dollar, which seems to be what the market wants. So I think that one's interesting. There's other conversation. Is this going to give a leg up to the largest financial institutions? There's still an opportunity. Our friends at Bank Social, Becky Reed and John Wingate, have been flying this flag for some time. I know they're very excited about it. Saw a press release from our friends at Metallicus as well, looking to put together a pilot program for credit unions to work around stablecoins. So we're going to be doing some more conversation around that one. Part of what this does is it theoretically will define what a stablecoin is, and also what it's not, which is interesting because JP Morgan Chase, which has been kind of, Jamie Dimon was famous for saying, I will fire anybody who does anything with crypto, is now coming out with what I think the market was thinking of as a stablecoin. They are now drawing the distinction. It's not exactly a stablecoin. They're calling it a tokenized deposit. And there is a distinction there, which is where you start getting into interesting, separation of the way the definition of stablecoin is being set up. Another criteria right now that's in the rule is you cannot pay interest on stablecoins. You can on tokenized deposits. That's going to be an interesting switch. We got a link to the story about the stablecoin, or the tokenized deposit initiative. Hasn't launched yet, but is actually well in flight in the R&D department at JP Morgan. Anyway, that's the big news that I was focusing on this week. And probably not coincidentally, our friends over at Circle, CRCL, the stablecoin company, USDC, the second biggest one after Tether, they are now, after being publicly traded for 2 weeks, trading at 9 times their original IPO price. They're over $270 a share right now. I think we can pretty much officially put them into meme coin or meme stock territory. That's a crazy valuation. It feels almost like the days of GameStop. It's been pointed out that it's one of the few pure plays out there if you want to go after stablecoin and getting all the attention as the Genius Act has most recently. That's probably a lot of what's been bidding that up. But watch this space. It's an interesting one as well. Not saying anything bad about the Circle stock, but that valuation has gotten pretty crazy pretty fast. With no further ado, anybody who knows me knows I love to dig into data, and the Federal Reserve is the best source for the most credible data. There's a whole bunch of different ways that they go about this. The diary and survey of consumer choice goes directly to consumers and polls them on behavior and attitudes, as opposed to the payment study, which goes after the back office and gets the hard number coming directly out of bank systems. So the latest just came out in May, and Claire Greene was gracious enough to sit down and talk to us about it. So let's have a listen. I'm here with Claire Greene, a longtime friend from the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, who works on surveys, and one in particular that is always of interest to me, an annual cycle, the Survey and Diary of Consumer Payments Choice, which I forget exactly when it came out. It hasn't been that long, but you've got the most freshly minted data on this. So Claire, thanks for taking some time to kind of walk us through it.
Thanks, Glenn. Glad to be here. The most recent data from October 2024 came out just in May, so just last month.
Great. And maybe if you could just start by reminding people, because it's two different sources of information here, both the diary and the survey out in the field for consumers. Can you kind of just give a quick overview?
Sure. So these are interlocking surveys that are given to the same group of respondents who are adults 18 years and older. In October 2024, about 5,000, almost 6,000 people took these surveys. And we do collect 3 basic types of information from consumers. First, what they think about various ways to pay. Second, whether or not they have adopted these various ways to pay, that is, they own them. For example, you have cash in your wallet, or it's the method is set up for your use. For example, you've set up your online banking bill pay. And then third, how you use these payment methods very specifically in particular situations. And when I say a payment method, I mean what we'll call the traditional ways to pay. So 3 ways to pay in paper: cash, checks, and money orders. 3 kinds of cards: credit, debit, and prepaid. And 2 ways to pay directly from a bank account, which we call either bank account number payment, where you're giving your information to a third party, or online banking bill payment, where you're using some sort of an interface at your bank in order to pay. And before I get much further along in the description, I'll just remind everyone that these remarks are my own and may not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System. That said, the Federal Reserve has been conducting these surveys in their current form for about 10 years for 3 reasons. First, to bring the voice of the consumer and user into discussions about payments innovation and consumer protection. So frequently when payments experts talk about payments, they're talking about the network connecting the end users on both sides and not so much about the end users. So that's a big part of our focus. And then second, of course, to inform the Federal Reserve's own decisions as a payment system provider. For example, making labor and capital investments in its cash processing. Third, for economists to understand the substitutions that may be occurring in the economy as consumer options and consumer preferences are changing. These surveys are unusual for 2 reasons. First is we include the consumer's whole wallet, so that includes cash. And second, we collect quite a bit of detail on each payment, including the dollar value, the date and time of the payment, who is the payee in terms of broad merchant categories, whether that payment was made remotely or in person, if some sort of a device, perhaps a phone or even the US mail, was used to make the payment. So a very rich data set of information about what consumers do, which then, of course, can lead us to either carefully research or as casual observers to speculate on why people do what they do, which of course is always impossible to figure out.
You know how I love to speculate on this stuff. That's right. And I will also say you've got a great, you disclose you've got the mother lode of the data set pretty much out there that people can interrogate themselves too, which I think is extremely helpful because like you say, there's so many different dimensions to this information.
Exactly. We do publish all of our survey data online. And in addition, we also publish tables so that a person who maybe doesn't want to be a computer programmer or really understand the data code book can also get some information from the Excel tables that we publish.
I think you teed me up for a whole bunch of additional questions I want to ask. I think one key point is this is the voice of the consumer as opposed to the other. And this is one of the years we're actually going to have the new triennial study from the Federal Reserve's payment systems report, which actually comes at it from the other side, from looking at what the banks are actually processing. And of course, the one difference there, and I shouldn't say of course, but this survey actually includes cash. That one only deals with non-cash payments.
I'll just add, all survey research involves all kinds of fine points. And so the Federal Reserve payment study does collect information about cash withdrawals and disaggregated by ATM, teller, et cetera. Those remote processing machines that the big box retailers have. Sorry, I don't know the term for that. And also about cash deposits. But you're right, it doesn't collect information about paying with cash.
And again, the key being you're getting this information from the business side of things, the banks.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are a number of differences, and you correctly identified, the administrative data where data is collected from financial institutions based on computerized records, as opposed to the consumer surveys, which are self-reported by people. And there are reasons. Different surveys have different purposes, and so there are reasons why you might want to choose one lens into this data versus another.
Yep.
The Federal Reserve Payment Study also collects data for a full year, and the consumer surveys estimate payment number and value for a particular month, which is October, which was selected back in the day because it was thought to be kind of a more neutral month, not too close to the holiday spending season, not too close to tax refunds or payments due. And then, as you already mentioned, the Federal Reserve Payment Study covers the entire compass of the economy, business, consumer, and government payments, while the survey and diary are focused on consumers only.
And
so each approach has, different benefits and different limitations. Our consumer surveys include rich demographic data, so you can associate the choices that people are making with either education, income, race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And also, because these surveys are executed using a panel at the University of Southern California, it's possible to link the data we collect to data from other surveys. For example, people responding to a survey about health, or during COVID, we were able to link responses to a survey about, did you leave the house for work, yes or no, to the payment behavior that flowed from that.
I thought it was interesting. You also can include, and I guess apparently there are a few money orders out there still, when you talked about the three forms of paper: checks, cash, money order. I guess I don't know how many of those were left. That can't be statistically significant, I can imagine.
It's quite a small number. And let's see here. I happen to have some tables open, and I can tell you
they're still negotiable. That surprises me in itself.
0.1 money orders per month per consumer in October 2024.
That's even higher than I would have expected. But one of the headlines here that I come away with is, and this has been, I think, an increasing trend now for some time, we continue on an average consumer, the number of payments they're making in a given month, or these specific October months, continues to go up. 48 payments, which is an all-time high, correct? I mean, I guess, and we had an interesting situation that and I think we can assume it's an all-time high. We don't have data from before, like you said, 10 years ago, but it had been continually on an increasing trend until the pandemic, when it shot all the way back down for obvious reasons to the range. I think hit a low of 35 and 36. And then now it is kind of gradually come back and exceeded where we were pre-pandemic.
Yes. I think that it's becoming increasingly difficult to think about pre-pandemic in the context of data from 2025. And that the pandemic, a friend of mine said the other day, the pandemic was like we had a war. And so it was had such a cataclysmic impact on so many aspects of people's lives. Some with direct impact on payments. There was, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were afraid to touch cash, and people were, spraying cleaner on cash and all that sort of thing. But also just in terms of all the various aspects of life that changed. So it was, maybe you wouldn't call it a controlled experiment in any sort of a way where you could say, as a result of COVID, this happened, or as a result of this aspect of COVID, here's something.
That's a really good point. I mean, you also can't say this was exactly the start date and the end date. You can't expect that suddenly someone declares COVID over and the world just goes back exactly to the way that it was. And we even saw that over time. And we have seen changes of behaviors at movie theaters and restaurants and carry out and things like that. And some of those were underway already, but it just created a total shock to the system. The two other things that I noticed that you talk about, you call out in the headlines as being statistically significant changes from the prior year, is the share of people who use cash or checks in the prior 30-day period, both being down. Cash down from 87% to 83%, and I think checks being down from 40 to 35. So those are both forms of paper. So presumably we just continue to electronify further.
Yes, that's definitely something that you can see in this data when you look over the 10 years, some very big differences in the shares of payments people make in cash, in check usage, even for bill pay.
One of the other things, if you can help me interpret this, we obviously everybody talks about inflation year over year, but there was the average amount of money that people spent on payments over just in a 1 year stretch increased by 28%. That's a lot more than inflation. And I'm trying to figure out, is that an apples to apples comparison, or is there some double counting in there? Because I can't figure out, credit card balances didn't go up that much. Savings balances didn't go down that much. Where did that extra money come from?
Well, so the first thing to keep in mind is that our survey measures payments, but it does not measure personal consumption. This goes back to the idea, different surveys are collecting information to be used for different purposes. So the BLS is collecting information about personal consumption to roll up into GDP, for example. And this survey, because it measures payments, includes some items that would be excluded from personal consumption. And that would include loan payments, any transfers a person makes to an investment account or any kind of savings, and also tax payments, which are not included in personal consumption. And then on the other side, we only ask about payments the individual made, himself or herself. And personal consumption does include money paid by others on our behalf. So, for example, if I have a doctor's appointment and my medical insurer pays for part of that doctor's appointment, that's included in personal consumption, but it's not included in a payment that I would report in this survey.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot more ins and outs than I realized. I still have a hard time reconciling the difference in my head, but I can see why you can't just assume that the two ought to trail each other directly. I'm also really interested, by the way, when you think about the 48 monthly payments on average, how they break out. It's like there's 32, which I guess is almost exactly 3/4 of them are by, or is that, no, 2/3 rather, by card, 8 of them by paper, and 7 by ACH, which I guess for the most part is roughly what I expected. And then the other statistic you give is that 17 of those 48 payments are for everyday items, groceries, drugstores, online shopping. 10 are for food consumed outside the house, a little bit higher than I would have thought. 4 for gas stations, 4 payments being made to financial institutions, 2 person to person. That still leaves a fair number. I mean, I guess you must have a whole bunch of categories. There's a long tail there to kind of account for the rest.
So one thing when we set up these categories we were interested in was distinguishing between payments for services versus payments for goods. Also, rent payments, of course, charitable and religious donations, payments to another person, whether that's a gift, an allowance, or a casual payment for work performed. It is the case that food away from home, when you add together the restaurants and the bars and the fast food, you come up to about 20% by number. And then the grocery stores, the convenience stores, and the pharmacies are another 19%. So one thing we do see in this data is that when it comes to frequency of payments, we are all thinking about eating all the time.
That'd be an interesting cultural kind of comparison if we had similar data for other countries. I'm thinking, we probably buy more fast food and frequent, outings outside the home. But on the other hand, at least in Europe, the stereotype people shop more on a daily basis for their take-home groceries too. So I wonder how those two would kind of balance out. Yeah, the other disconnect, though, and you and I talked about this a little bit separately, is The one place that I had a hard time really reconcile, and again, my bad for trying to reconcile the data because it's not necessarily supposed to, but the payment study, the data that comes directly from the banks, actually shows debit cards being the most frequently used item. And in this study, it actually shows credit cards, at least in terms of what the consumers are directly reporting themselves, being the bigger one. And you mentioned that you think you've got a pretty good feel based on, kind of laying the two sets of data next to each other to see where the differences might reside.
Well, this is a question, of course, that we have investigated, 6 ways to Sunday, basically. My colleague, Marcin Hitsenko at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has done a good amount of work over a number of years looking at this data and trying to identify where the divergence is occurring. Because, of course, administrative data versus, computer created versus submitted by a person, your tendency would be to have an assumption about where the error might be taking place.
Yeah.
And so we think currently that this is respondent underreporting of low dollar value payments, and mostly at convenience stores. And that's because Marcin looked into publicly available data from convenience stores. Anecdotally, I can also tell you that a few years ago, I was doing some testing of the survey with friends and family. And after a friend of mine took the survey, I said to him, well, what did you learn? And his response was, I learned I eat a candy bar every day. And he said he thought he had one maybe once or twice a week for a treat. So there is your survey underreporting. So our respondents, so another point that supports this theory is that our respondents do state a preference for debit cards for low dollar value payments. And this question about how do you like to pay for by dollar value, we last asked in 2020, but these sorts of preferences tend to hold up over time.
And your definition of low value is under $50, I believe?
No, golly. I think it's under 10.
Oh, wow, okay.
I mean, really, $50, $100 is a big payment. Like we have $1,500 payments in our survey, of course. People have to pay their rent, et cetera. But there also are a lot of small dollar value payments. So, and so Marcin did this again, you compare the payment study, Federal Reserve payment study, to the survey and diary data by the dollar value of the payments. The higher value debit payments, like more than $50, align. It's, the lower dollar values that seem to be off.
Gotcha.
And also looking at the payment study, when you look at in-person credit, that number does track more closely to the Federal Reserve payment study. And so think about a credit card payment not for everyone, for points mavens, they're going to make all their payments with a credit card, but some people do reserve credit card payments for, let's call them important purchases with maybe higher dollar value, and thus they are perhaps more memorable. So we do a lot of things to try to encourage people to remember everything. And, this will be, I'm sure, a source of continued investigation. It's also challenging when you're collecting survey data, because once you start messing around with the questionnaires, you have to think really hard about year-to-year comparability.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the values, is being able to compare over the course of the last decade. So that helps to explain why it appears that small dollar debit transactions are basically small value transactions are underreported. And if we can assume that debit and cash are probably the biggest areas, the biggest instruments for those small payments, you could probably make an argument that cash is underreported too. Would you agree?
Well, I can't make that argument based on the data, so I won't do it.
Okay, but I will.
Go right ahead.
So, kind of continuing to that conversation around credit cards, I thought this was interesting that it looks like transactors and revolvers, people who pay off their balance every month being a transactor versus revolvers who carry a balance, stays pretty evenly split around 50-50. And it also looks like the median, not the mean, but the median card balance continues to be roughly the same, about 2,600. I don't know if that is that a per card or a per individual balance.
Oh, that's a per person.
That's what I thought.
So
Okay.
one thing to think about, another survey complexity is our unit of reporting is the individual, not the household.
Good point.
And many surveys, for example, the FDIC survey of banked and underbanked households, the Fed's survey of household economics and decision making, which is another good data source that just came out last week, also is a household survey. It is the case that that survey estimates, does ask questions about card debt and card adopters, and it finds pretty much the same 50-50 relationship between revolvers and convenience users.
It was the fact that the balance didn't go up. I thought that was particularly interesting. You also pointed out that roughly 1 out of 5 credit card users paid an annual fee. Now my guess is that's probably a combination of the folks who are paying an annual fee because they have a very rewards rich card, Chase Sapphires, American Express, stuff like that, as well as probably the folks who have low credit scores, and therefore those are the cards that tend to carry some kind of an annual price as well. Is that accurate, that it covers both of those kind of ends?
Well, we just say, did you pay a fee? Well, for rewards, the question is, think about the card you use most often to make payments. Is this card a rewards card? We do not ask, is this card a low credit score card, or is this an asset-backed card, or we don't have that.
But you do that.
And then,
that is the question about does it carry an annual fee is for your most common card?
No, that question is, I believe, did you pay a fee?
Okay.
If you have a credit card, you get the question, did you pay a fee?
Got it. Okay. And speaking of paying a fee, I think and this kind of gets further into the report, and I think it's a newer question you haven't been asking that long. The whole notion of card surcharging or discounting, it's kind of, carrot or stick on these things. Still uncommon, but it's becoming more common, right? I think it said that like 6% of those transactions are now have a discount to them.
6% of cash payments received a discount.
And I think that was only like 1%, like not that long ago, right?
When we talk about cash discounting, we're automatically talking about paying in person. So this is an incentive from the merchant at the in-person point of sale. When we look at surcharges, it could be, of course, either in person. I think many people have encountered surcharges many people, I won't say that. Some people have encountered surcharges at restaurants. But surcharges can also occur when in a bill paying environment, when the utility, for example, wants you to, provide your account information so they can have an ACH debit as opposed to a credit card payment with the fees that result. So that kind of steering, there's those two different kinds of steering into pretty different situations.
When we talk about surcharging, did you do anything to distinguish between debit and credit card? I mean, in theory, I would think that the surcharge would only apply to credit card because that's the one that really carries the higher interchange. And by definition, with the Durbin Amendment, the debit card shouldn't. But based on what I've seen, most places don't really bother to distinguish. And I think it's because their service provider behind the scenes, the ISO, is probably charging a blended rate. I don't know. You probably don't get into that level of detail, but.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know about the merchant pricing side. I only know about the consumer experience side. And one clarification I should offer on this point is that surcharges are only permitted on credit cards. However, on a debit card, you can charge a convenience fee or an extra charge or some other kind of fee. And we certainly in our data see more surcharging happening on credit cards.
Yeah, I think I'm not surprised to see more on credit cards. I wonder. And like I say, I'm not blaming any, to at one level, it's, people probably don't understand the rules when you're talking about the typical mom and pop merchant. On the other level, it's like if they wind up paying the same amount regardless because of the way their ISO is set up the system, they don't have any real reason to take a different approach to it. But again, that's probably more than you're able to get out of this survey.
I think the only thing I would say to that is I think that you get to a certain point and the consumer needs a simpler choice.
Yes.
If you're going to make people do too much math to figure out how they should pay their bill, or especially at the point of sale, forget it, right? Because at the point of sale, I've had many merchants say to me when I ask them what they take, they say, I'll take whatever you'll give me. So that's a different situation. You were talking about carrot and stick, right? That's the carrot situation.
Yeah.
Your first priority is close the sale.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and again, this should be the piece that does not create friction. Most likely, the merchant, like you say, you're right to the end gate, and you want to finish the sale, and you're not going to do anything to complicate it. Well, Claire, as always, this stuff is fascinating. As I said, the data set is out there. Everything's out there for people to take a look, including the write up. Really a good readable write up you've done. The best place to track that down, is it a easy URL, or should we just post it in the show notes?
Sure. Just go to atlantafed.org, type in consumer diary, and you'll probably get there.
Great.
And I can send you the specific URL for the podcast notes, Glenn.
Great. And we will put that in the show notes, and hopefully people will track that down. And I'm sure, as you said, this has just been released in the last a couple of weeks. And I think you said you're analyzing in 6 ways to Sunday. I'm sure there's going to be more kind of tidbits coming out through your Take on Payments blog, which is great. I think, is it usually Mondays you post new content there? And this is a source.
Right, on Mondays. And this week's post is about check payments for bills.
Perfect. So I'll post a link to that as well. If people don't,
Great,
they should subscribe to that. Claire Greene from the Atlanta Fed. As always, a pleasure to talk.
Nice to chat, Glenn. Thank you.
So great stuff. And it just, if you expect data to be perfectly clean and tidy and do exactly what you want it to do, when you're actually out there in the real world, come on, let's get serious. It doesn't really work that way. So it's interesting to me that depending on which resource you look at, you're going to find some somewhat different conclusions. As Claire mentioned, we posted links not only to the survey and diary of consumer payment choice, but also to the SHED study that she mentioned about household attitudes, and also the FDIC study on unbanked and underbanked, which actually is a little bit older, 2023. But triangulating, I think, is a good thing. I mean, none of this stuff, well, with the exception of the Federal Reserve payment study, like I say, if it's coming directly out of the back end, but then it's limited in terms of demographic data and things like that. I think you take the full picture and you really start getting some good textures on all this stuff. So some links there that I encourage you to take a look at. I think you'll find them worthwhile. Posted another link as well that just came out. The Federal Reserve puts out so much good stuff. Their macro blog, macro being macroeconomics, just did a piece about the retirement of the penny. And they did some analysis of what that might mean in terms of impacts on the way people pay, the way people think about making change, and whether it will impact cash usage overall. So have a look at that, all those things in the show notes, which you can find by checking out the media tab. If you're not already listening to this at the Best Innovation Group website, big-fintech.com on the media tab, and you can find all our past episodes there as well. You should be able to find the show notes if you're listening on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, etc. Just click through. And if you haven't already, please just set yourself a reminder so you get our new content, which comes up pretty much every Tuesday. As I said, check out all the great stuff the Best Innovation Group has to offer as well at the website, including our development services around AI, integration with APIs. As John Best said, the merger world has been really, really busy lately, and he's been doing a lot on that. And we can certainly help if your credit union is involved in anything along those lines. which usually will tend to involve core conversions and things like that. We're also very skilled on that stuff as well. You can check out the Best Innovation Group by finding us on LinkedIn. That's Best Innovation Group, or you can find John Best, our grand poobah, at JB Fintech. My name is Glen Sarvati. You can find me via my firm, 154 Advisors, on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. As I said, every Tuesday, new content. Please check us out. And as always, thanks for listening.
Check back each week for the latest from the Big Cast. Or better yet, we hope you'll consider subscribing for free via Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Tweet us at Big Fintech, email info@big-fintech.com, or visit us at big-fintech.com and click on the Media tab, where you can post a comment or check out our archive of hundreds of past episodes. See you next week.